Welcome to Crying Out Cloud, the podcast that will make you laugh, cry, and reconsider all of your cloud security fears. I'm Eden from the CTO team at Wiz, and I'm here with my fabulous co-host, Amitai.
Hello.
From the threat research team at Wiz. And we are about to get into some wild stories going down in the cloud as of late. You ready?
I'm ready.
We have 3 stories for today. Amitai, what are we going to go over?
First story, GameOverlay, which is a privilege escalation vulnerability in Ubuntu.
Is this game over?
Only if you have run out of tokens or coins.
And for the second story?
P2P infect, which is a botnet targeting exposed Redis instances.
So earlier, Amitai and I were sitting, and we asked ChatGPT if we could think of a funny joke about P2P infect.
Oh boy.
Why did the computer join P2P infect, the botnet targeting Redis?
Because it heard they had a great network for spreading bite-sized gossip.
And that was after we pushed generate response like 5 times. So
This was the best it could do. I am disappointed.
You're welcome. And the third
AI will
story?
not be taking over the world anytime soon.
Or at least not the comedy show.
Mhm.
What is our third story for today?
Our third story is that Jumpcloud, a company, was hacked by North Korea.
So for our first story, GameOverlay, the privilege escalation vulnerabilities in Ubuntu. The Wiz Research team, our friends Sagi and Sheer,
Represent.
shout out, discovered a pair of vulnerabilities affecting Ubuntu that could allow an attacker with an existing access to a machine to escalate their privileges. Some context, this is an overlay file system, which is 2 file systems on top of each other, very cleverly named upper and lower layer.
Simple is best.
Yeah.
You want to name things, you want to keep them simple. You don't want to give them
No
crazy
confusion.
names like Wiz.
So the lower one is read-only, and it's more secure for sensitive stuff. And the upper one is writable, and therefore less secure. And Overlay FS has a history. It has a reputation for several... Bad reputation.
A dangerous reputation.
It's almost like the Taylor Swift song, Bad Reputation.
Mm.
Had several privilege escalation vulnerabilities over the years. And now there's this one. Will you tell us about this vulnerability?
The latest one. So I lied before. It is not 1, it is 2.
Mm.
There are 2
Peace.
vulnerabilities that we called GameOverlay. The reason we gave them the same name is just because they're very, very similar to each other. They're basically exploiting the same root cause, but just through 2 different paths. But basically they're the same. So the vulnerability, the root cause is that a user or an attacker can take an unprivileged executable file from the lower layer, which is the privileged layer that nobody's supposed to touch, unwritable, and you basically trick the kernel into copying it to the upper layer, the writable layer, and then it gains more privileges than it had before, and then the user who has access to the upper layer can now escalate their privileges to root.
Crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And what's bad about this is also that it exploits older similar vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so like exploits for the older vulnerabilities you mentioned before that were also like in the same area, they work out of the box for this, which is kind of dangerous because often
Kinda.
like basically attackers could start exploiting this tomorrow if they wanted, like from the moment, not tomorrow, well, we're a few days after the publication at this point, but like let's go back in time to the day it was published, they could start exploiting immediately just by reusing old exploits.
But how come they work out of the box?
So that's a really good question. Not basically, because this is actually really complicated. I spent a lot of time with Shir and Sagi trying to understand this myself. There were a lot of modifications made to both Linux and Ubuntu over the past few years, since like 2018, to make this possible. What happened was that Ubuntu made some changes to their specific implementation to Overlay FS. Every distribution in Linux does this. They make their own little tweaks to stuff. And Ubuntu probably didn't think they were doing anything too important or too significant here. They probably were assuming that they were making changes to an area of code that was probably not going to change too much in the other distributions or in the generic Linux kernel. And about 2 years later, Linux actually started making a few changes into this area, and Ubuntu just didn't pick up the changes. And one of those was a mitigation that Linux had added against vulnerabilities of this nature. So all the other distributions were, as of 2020, protected against this sort of stuff. But Ubuntu, because they made these changes, they couldn't enjoy the benefits of these mitigations.
They were not invited to the party.
Well, they disinvited
themselves
to the party, yes.
What's interesting about this is it's a privilege escalation vulnerability, which usually would kind of be of secondary concern. We wouldn't think as much about that, but because the attacker would still need to gain code execution permissions on the machine in the first place. But in this case, it's a little bit bigger of a deal. How much risk does this create for cloud customers?
So like privilege escalation vulnerabilities in like just an app that might be installed in a small percentage of cloud customers. So those cloud customers are going to have to deal with it, but this isn't like something that every single cloud security team is going to have to handle. But with Ubuntu, I don't think you'd be able to find a single environment in the cloud, or at least probably a very, very small percentage, that doesn't have Ubuntu installed somewhere, right?
Do you Ubuntu?
Ubuntu? I Ubuntu every day. And our data actually shows that about 40% of all Ubuntu machines in the cloud are affected by this vulnerability, which is
big.
A lot, yeah. So my guess is that every single cloud security team since this was published has had to deal with triaging this vulnerability.
Speaking of, how should our friends using Ubuntu protect their environments against GameOverlay?
Our Ubuntu pals. So since exploits that already exist work out of the box for this, in a sense, it's sort of a 0-day because this was already exploitable before. I'm guessing it's possible that attackers actually did exploit this and just didn't know that this was what they were exploiting. Like they tried the exploit for something else and it worked, right, on Ubuntu. And they might have not known why.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's a 0-day, which makes it a bit more concerning, as we mentioned. But again, it's still a privilege escalation. You still need to get code execution beforehand. You still need either another vulnerability or stolen creds or weak password or no password. It needs to be exposed to the internet. So there are a bunch of different things that have to happen before this actually becomes a concern. So I think the best advice we could give is, don't rush. Focus on machines where you have other risk factors in addition to this.
Cool. Speaking of bad things, for our second story, we have the P2P infect. Here's what went down. Botnet agent was discovered by Cato and a few others, and they detected in their honeypots. And what they saw is they were targeting exposed Redis instances with weak authentication.
Right.
Just so everyone listening is on the same page, Redis is a very popular, lightweight database that people use. So anyways, post this weak authentication, they then went and exploited a vulnerability in Redis and or abused a database replication feature.
Correct.
Nifty. For the record, this is not the first time a botnet targeted Redis, right?
Yes. Redis is very popular among attackers. There are several reasons for this. One is, like you mentioned, it's really popular, which always means that it's worthwhile to invest in looking for vulnerabilities in this and looking for misconfigurations, in scanning the internet for it, because you're going to find something to hang on to. And the second is that Redis often contains interesting information on its own. So like if it's exposed to the internet and you get in, then boom, you have interesting information. And the second reason that it becomes useful is that Redis often grants you code execution privileges on the machine that it's running because it's a database management system. So Redis has a lot of potential for attackers, basically.
But what's interesting is these specific attackers, we don't know what they were doing with the infected machines, right?
Yeah. So the companies that looked into this, like you mentioned, they only saw this on their honeypots. And they didn't actually see any evidence of crypto mining. Like there were hints that maybe that was a feature that the attacker had implemented, like there was stuff named miner, but it seems like that wasn't active. So it seems like this is someone just developing real estate, like trying to get their hands on as many instances as possible so that one day they can do something with this.
So listen carefully to what's to come so you don't become part of the one day of what they're going to do with this access.
Yeah, exactly. Like, even if nothing bad is happening now, eventually something bad's going to happen with this.
Big red flag. Before we go a little bit deeper into this, I have a general question. In this specific instance, Cato and other companies found this using honeypots. But how does one, in general, find a botnet or other suspicious attacker activity?
That's a good question. So honeypots are definitely a popular way to find stuff. They're
sweet.
Yeah, no, they are. You catch more botnets with honey, right?
Mm-hmm.
You basically set up a bunch of servers. You make them purposely misconfigured or vulnerable to make them easier for attackers to attack.
Mm-hmm.
And you also put interesting stuff in them, often fake stuff, to make them more attractive. So that once an attacker finds them, they stick around and they start doing whatever they do.
There is money here.
No, like you either put like, crypto mining wallet addresses, you put like fake databases with a bunch of, information that looks like it's personal information. You put a bunch of documents that say top secret. You name stuff like admin, whatever. You make it look interesting anyway. So, and then once the attackers start targeting this stuff, they install their malware, they start doing post-exploitation activity. You see them trying to move laterally, and this lets you sort of look at the attackers like they're in a zoo and figure out what they're doing. But the thing is that this will only catch the sort of attackers trying to find low-hanging fruit, mostly. So it'll be people scanning the internet who don't really care where they end up. Yeah. So this is what's called like an opportunistic attacker or an omnidirectional attack.
This isn't your Chinese or North Korean nation-state actor.
Yeah. So like you do have nation-state actors who also scan the internet and try to grab onto whatever they can grab on, but not for like the espionage stuff. That's mostly for like they're trying to create, relay boxes that they can use as proxies, or maybe, just to, if they happen to find something interesting, then they'll stick around.
Yeah.
But mostly it's going to be botnets and crypto minings and stuff like that. So if you want to find like the really interesting stuff, you either need to be, like an MDR company or an EDR company, or have antivirus agents installed on customer networks, and then you're having a lot of telemetry, being fed back to you. You have customers reporting.
Customers calling you.
Yeah, like they're saying like something weird is going on here. Help me.
Yeah.
And that lets you find more interesting stuff. Often, the really interesting stuff you'll only find on like one customer because it's that rare, like it's that highly targeted.
And it's that customer.
Yeah. And finally, the last way that this stuff gets discovered is through incident response, where basically you have a customer or some organization finds something weird and they call someone experienced with this kind of stuff in to help them, and then that reveals all sorts of interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So zooming back out, P2P infect found by honeypots. First of all, thank you for the explanation. But why do they call it that, by the way?
So P2P stands for peer-to-peer, which basically is a type of network where you don't have...
Not puppy to puppy?
Not puppy to puppy, although I hope someday, the technology reaches
that level.
Where we can do like puppy to puppy networks. Like put on little cute collars where they mine bitcoins.
It's a good visual.
Anyway, so peer-to-peer is a network where you don't have like a central server commanding all the other agents. Like they all sort of communicate with each other and they exchange messages. And then the attacker basically, in order to send commands to their botnet, like mine this crypto or send to this wallet or do a DDoS attack on this IP address, they basically join the network as one of the bots. And then they just start dropping messages into it.
Okay, so what should customers and people do to protect against P2P?
So the reports that we have listed in the links have IOCs. You should scan for those in your environment. And as you mentioned, the botnet is infecting machines that have Redis installed and are either vulnerable to a CVE or have been misconfigured. And the root cause to all of this is that they have weak authentication. So for starters, make sure that if you have Redis running, you have a strong password protecting it. Ideally, it shouldn't be exposed to the internet at all. It should only allow connections from a VPN or be inside some internal network. But if it has to be publicly exposed, at least make sure that it's patched and make sure that it's properly configured.
Fab. That's my new phrase, fab. Okay, speaking of more bad things on the internet, our third story for today is the Jumpcloud incident. So today I learned that Amitai doesn't know the Drake song Jumpman.
No,
Why?
I
No excuses.
no, I know the song. I didn't know it by
He didn't know
by
my
name.
version.
Okay, yes.
My version is about Jumpcloud. Should I perform it for everyone?
Yes.
But play the music. Jumpcloud, North Korea, up to something. Okay. Jumpcloud offers a device management solution so admins can control a bunch of machines at once.
Mm-hmm.
They were hacked in late June. And slowly, more information has been trickling. We've been learning about this incident.
Many companies reporting on this from many different angles.
Yes. The attack has been attributed to our friends in North Korea. And
The other stars of this podcast.
And it turned out to be a supply chain attack on Jumpcloud's customers. No surprise to any of us, since North Korea is behind this. Many of them are crypto companies. How did Jumpcloud get attacked?
So we don't have a lot of information on that. What we have to go on is
Did they get jumped? Sorry, I had to.
I give you one more use of this
jump.
fun. One more.
You can kill it until it's dead.
You have a quota. So according to their blog post, which is basically all we have to go on at this point as to how they were actually hacked, it looks like an employee was spearphished, which means that they got an email from the attackers that tried to probably convince them to click something, and then, bad stuff happened on their computer. Yeah.
And then what did the attacker do once they
So once they got access,
jumped in?
that's it. You're done.
That's it, I'm done.
No more. Are you sure you want to spend it on that? You don't
I
want to
already
save
did.
it? Okay, fine.
Behind us.
Too bad. We have a lot more to talk about. So once the attacker gained access to this employee, we assume, again, all they said was spear phishing. From there, they got access to their internal systems, one of which was the server that controls their agents, which are deployed in their customers' environments. So this is basically the server through which their customers send commands to be run on their own networks. And from what we understand from their blog post, the attacker gained access to the system, and they basically used it to inject scripts that were running on customers' machines. So basically, if you were a Jumpcloud customer and this attacker chose to target you, they had RCE on basically your entire fleet of machines.
That's nuts.
Yes.
How do we know this was North Korea?
So that's a good question. There seemed to be a lot of evidence linking to them.
Overwhelming evidence,
Yeah.
really.
First of all, so Jumpcloud published a few IOCs related to this. Some of them are domains that are impersonating all sorts of popular services like CentOS, stuff like that. I'm guessing that was like an attempt to blend in with the traffic, because if someone was looking at the logs, they'd see like, oh, it's something related to CentOS. Like, I can ignore this. It's possible that they were like trying to make it very, very specific to Jumpcloud customers who were also customers of, let's say, CentOS, but I don't know. And SentinelOne looked into these IOCs once they were published, and they found a bunch of connections between them and historical activity that has previously been attributed to North Korea by the US government, by a bunch of other companies that have been looking into this. They also matched one of the domains to an advisory that was published by GitHub around the same time as Jumpcloud's advisory, which is interesting because GitHub's advisory is about social engineering attacks that are being targeted against tech workers.
Oh, wow.
So it's possible that what GitHub is talking about is exactly what Jumpcloud was talking about when they mentioned spear phishing. But again, we don't know. This is all speculation. So Sentinel-1 also found links to malicious NPM packages. Those were discovered by a company called Phylum. They do supply chain security, stuff like that, and a bunch of other stuff that was also attributed to North Korea. So no matter how you look at this, North Korea.
Thank you for painting the picture.
One more paint
Oh, okay.
I will throw on
One
the
more
picture,
stroke.
which is that Mandiant also ran an investigation on one of Jumpcloud's customers. So they sort of saw this incident from like the eyes of one of the customers. And they found the malware that was being run through the scripting engine. It seems to mostly be targeting Mac devices. And the malware was also linked back to North Korea. One more very, very, very strong connection to North Korea is that the attackers seem to have made a mistake. And most of the time they were using a VPN, but one time...
They forgot to turn on their VPN.
Yes.
Hilarious.
Or maybe it failed or something like that. Anyway, it was a North Korean IP.
Dead giveaway. Okay, what are the takeaways?
Since this was a supply chain attack, ultimately the responsibility here and most of what can be done to mitigate this is on the vendor. So it's on Jumpcloud to make sure this doesn't happen again, to make sure that they close all the holes, that they get rid of the attacker completely.
Yes.
Because the attacker could do a lot of damage just by sitting in their network, even if they don't touch customer environments. But if you are not a Jumpcloud customer, stop listening to this podcast now.
Don't stop. Just
skip ahead.
do the +10 thing.
Yeah. If you are a Jumpcloud customer, then you should check your network for the IOCs that were published by all of the companies I mentioned before. Links in the podcast. And that's it. That's all you can do.
Fabulous. Okay, time for the podaways. Take-a-pods. Takeaways. For the first story, GameOverlay.
So for that, like we said, patch, but don't rush. Focus on stuff that is high risk anyway.
For P2P infect.
So always use strong authentication for Redis. Always use strong authentication for everything. Scan for IOCs in your network. And try to avoid misconfiguring Redis whenever possible.
And for the Jumpcloud incident.
If you are a Jumpcloud customer, scan your network for IOCs. I'm assuming Jumpcloud also reached out to all of the customers that were affected by this. They said that only 5 were affected, which is a pretty small number. They said they have 200,000 customers and only 5 were affected. So this is really targeted. If you were among them, I'm assuming Jumpcloud reached out. Yeah.
And that's all for this episode of Crying Out Cloud, presented by the cloud security company, Wiz. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and remember, unlike your IAM policies, more stars is better. And as always, if your cloud security strategy is making you cry, don't worry. Just cry out cloud.